I froze in the doorway, the words hanging in the air like smoke I couldn't breathe. Diane's voice cut through the living room, sharp and relentless. "Why don't you just disappear? You ruined our lives." Caleb, my son, stood nearby, arms crossed, nodding as if her words were gospel. My chest tightened, a familiar ache of disbelief and betrayal settling over me. The room was still, though heavy with judgment. Not a single hand reached out to stop her, not a single word in my defense. My own voice felt foreign in my throat, unnecessary against their certainty. I had spent decades trying to hold this family together, trying to keep peace between stubborn wills and fragile egos. And here I was, dismissed, blamed, reduced to an inconvenience. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. Instead, I turned and walked down the narrow hallway, each step quiet but deliberate. The carpet was worn underfoot, the familiar smell of home now suffocating. I collected my bag from the corner. Nothing sentimental inside, just essentials I would need for the next step, wherever it might lead. Caleb said nothing as I passed him, and Diane's eyes followed me, blazing with triumph, or perhaps disbelief. I didn't look back. The silence of the house pressed against me, thick and uncompromising. But it wasn't my burden to carry anymore. My heart beat steadily, not in panic, but in a quiet affirmation I could leave, and I would. I closed the door behind me with a gentle click, the sound final, not loud, but resolute. The night outside was cool, the streets empty. I walked down the block, each step taking me further from the family that had redefined me in their own image and closer to the clarity I needed. The next chapter would begin with a place to rest and a mind finally free to think. I stepped into the cool night air and pulled the door gently behind me, listening to the faint click of the lock, as if it were marking a line I had finally drawn. The streets of Charlotte were quiet, empty of cars. Quiet enough that even the distant hum of neon signs seemed muted. My bag rested heavily on my shoulder, not because of what I carried, but because of all I was leaving behind, the years of unnoticed efforts, the countless silences, the invisible labor of keeping a family's fragile harmony intact. Walking past the familiar streetlights, I let my thoughts wander to the patterns that had defined my life. I had spent decades blending into the background, mediating fights, smoothing over egos, and sacrificing my own voice for the sake of appearances. Every accomplishment had been overshadowed by someone else's recognition, every attempt at connection dismissed or minimized. I remembered birthdays, overlooked conversations cut short, gestures of love returned with indifference. It was a long history of invisibility that had shaped my patience, my quiet endurance, but also my loneliness. Tonight the pattern would break. I didn't know where I would go or what awaited me, but for the first time in years I felt the strange relief of stepping away without needing permission. My steps were measured, each one a testament to a resolve I had only just allowed myself to acknowledge. I thought of Caleb caught between loyalty to his mother and the child who had once trusted him. I thought of Diane, so certain of her power that she couldn't see it had already begun to slip. As I walked toward the edge of the neighborhood, past houses that had once felt like anchors and now felt like chains, I realized that leaving was not surrender. It was the first act of reclaiming a life that had been defined by others for too long. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew I had crossed a threshold, and the road ahead was mine to navigate. The next chapter would be about finding a temporary refuge, a place to rest, and the first steps toward rebuilding what had been taken from me. The neon sign flickered above the small downtown motel as I stepped inside, the faint scent of bleach and old carpet greeting me. The man at the front desk glanced up briefly, then back to the muted television behind him and muttered, "Cash or card?" I handed him the last of my money, and he slid a key across the counter with a shrug. barely noticing me. The room was modest, a single bed, a nightstand, a cracked lamp. But it was mine for the night, a temporary refuge from the storm of judgment I had left behind. I set my bag on the edge of the bed and sank into the chair by the window. The city lights twinkled below, indifferent to my presence, and I let my mind drift. For decades I had labored in silence, offering guidance, encouragement, and care that had been taken for granted. Every thoughtful gesture, every moment of support, every quiet effort to keep peace had gone unnoticed, dismissed, or erased. Diane's accusations tonight were the culmination of years spent in the shadows of their approval. At a small cafe nearby, I ordered a coffee, the barista nodding politely as she handed it over. A few regulars were absorbed in their laptops, immersed in their own worlds. It struck me that here among strangers, my presence mattered in small, tangible ways. No expectations, no judgment, just acknowledgement of the work I could offer, the expertise I still possessed. I sipped the coffee slowly, letting the warmth anchor me. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to think about what I wanted rather than what was expected of me. The layers of neglect and erasure were heavy, but in this solitude, I could examine them clearly without interruption or dismissal. I realized that value is not assigned by others. It is recognized through action and self-acknowledgement, even if it is unseen by those who should have noticed long ago. As night deepened, I returned to the motel room, placing my cup carefully on the nightstand. Tomorrow, I would begin taking the first steps toward reclaiming my life piece by piece, skill by skill. The next chapter would be about rebuilding through deliberate action, finding purpose in the work that had always defined me. The next morning, I left the motel with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. My bag was light, my mind clear, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the weight of anyone else's expectations pressing against my shoulders. I walked a few blocks to a small cafe near the bus depot, the sign outside promising free Wi-Fi and coffee refills. It wasn't luxurious, but it was exactly what I needed: a place to focus, to begin rebuilding the part of myself that had been ignored for so long. I logged into the tutoring platforms I had bookmarked years ago, but never used. My profile, dusty and forgotten, was a record of decades of experience: SAT and ACT prep, mentoring, writing, guidance, patient, and reliable. I updated it carefully, highlighting skills I had honed over decades: the ability to guide, to explain, to listen, to inspire. I applied to several listings focusing on parents and students who were looking for someone with experience and patience. Responses came quickly, almost unexpectedly. A mother from uptown Charlotte reached out, asking if I could help her daughter struggling with the SAT. Another inquiry came from a young adult preparing for the GED. Even the smallest acknowledgments: "Your approach makes so much sense," or "You really understand how to explain this," felt like a balm to the years of invisibility I had endured. Each small victory reinforced my confidence. For the first time in decades, I felt seen. Sitting there with a notebook open, I began organizing my schedule, noting who I would tutor, the sessions I could offer, and the plans for follow-up. Each completed application, each positive response added weight to my sense of agency. I realized that the validation I had longed for from family could be found elsewhere, not in their nods or approval, but in the respect and recognition of strangers who valued my knowledge and care. By the time the cafe started filling with the morning rush, I had confirmed my first session and booked 2 more. My hands ached slightly from writing notes and logging details, but the ache was good, a reminder that I was moving forward. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, I felt capable, steady, and in control. Tomorrow, I would continue building, learning how to translate decades of skill into tangible progress, one session at a time. I had just finished reviewing the feedback from my latest tutoring session when a notification caught my attention. A local education blog had shared a new, innovative curriculum created by Diane. I clicked through, and my heart sank. Every diagram, every lesson structure, every exercise bore my signature style. Her name was at the top, presented as if she had spent decades refining it. I stared at the screen, disbelief and anger coiling in my chest. How could she take credit for work I had poured myself into for years? That night, I began digging through my archives. Drafts, old lesson plans, emails to students and colleagues all lined up chronologically to show my authorship. Each file I pulled out reminded me of the late nights and meticulous revisions that had gone unseen. I labeled everything, organizing dates, annotations, and versions, building a clear chain of evidence. I needed this documented irrefutable. While assembling the files, my eyes fell on a forgotten folder marked Grandma. Inside was a scanned copy of her will, yellowed at the edges, but perfectly legible. I opened it, and relief washed over me as I read her words. All educational materials, tutoring frameworks, and curriculum I had developed were legally mine. She had anticipated the kind of erasure I was now confronting and had protected my intellectual property before her death. Holding that document, I felt both grief and a spark of validation. Diane's theft was audacious, but no longer unchallenged. With the will and my compiled evidence, I could reclaim what was rightfully mine. For the first time, I felt the steady, cold clarity of empowerment. My years of unnoticed effort, my meticulous attention, all mattered. I printed copies of the files, ordered them in sequence, and began drafting a plan to confront the appropriation. This was no longer abstract betrayal. It was actionable, undeniable, and strategic. Tomorrow, I would take the first formal steps to assert my ownership and protect my work through the proper legal channels. The next morning, I drove to the attorney's office clutching the printed will and my organized folder of evidence. The streets of Charlotte passed in muted streaks as I rehearsed what I would say, keeping my voice calm even as a rush of adrenaline surged through me. I had spent years being dismissed, my work appropriated, and now, finally, I held the proof that everything I had built was legally mine. Margot, an intellectual property attorney in her 50s, greeted me with a sharp but measured glance. I explained the situation succinctly, showing her the timeline drafts emails and the scanned will. Her eyes flicked between documents, absorbing the meticulous record I had compiled. After a moment, she leaned back and said, "You don't need a lawsuit to take back what's yours. You just need a formal claim. Everything is documented well enough to establish your rights clearly." I nodded, relief washing over me in subtle waves. The legal process felt almost secondary to the validation I experienced just by seeing the acknowledgement of ownership in Margot's eyes. This was more than paperwork. It was recognition of decades of effort, of knowledge refined and shared, of contributions erased and now restored. We discussed next steps, filing formal documentation, sending notices, and preparing a strategy in case Diane challenged the claim. Every detail was deliberate, calculated, and measured. For the first time in years, I felt fully in control not just of my work, but of the narrative that had been rewritten without my consent. I left the office with copies of all the filings and a quiet determination. The legal process would formalize what had always been mine, and nothing Diane could do would erase that. The next chapter would be the first confrontation where evidence and authority would replace the silence that had kept me invisible for so long. By mid-morning, my phone began buzzing insistently on the motel nightstand. One call, 2, 3, then a steady stream until the screen displayed 14 missed calls. Caleb's name flashed repeatedly. Diane's included each notification, a reminder of the life I had left behind. I let the first few ring, unanswered, my thumb, hovering over the screen, but refusing to engage. Finally, I listened to the voicemail Diane had left. Her voice was calmer than I remembered, almost pleading. Ilara, we need your help. The curriculum, the sessions, everything. You're the only one who can fix this. Please call back. I leaned back in my chair, absorbing the irony. The woman who had spent years erasing my contributions was now asking for assistance, as if nothing had ever happened. Caleb's message followed. His tone was measured, hesitant. Mom's right. We can't manage this without you. I know things were tense, but I need your guidance. The words pricked something old and familiar, a tug of guilt, a sense of obligation. But I recognized it for what it was, an attempt to manipulate, to pull me back into the web of their control. I sat quietly, the weight of years pressing down, and made a decision. I would not answer immediately. I would not allow their urgency to dictate my response. Boundaries, I reminded myself, were not negotiable, even with my own son. I drafted a brief reply in my head, acknowledgement of the situation. No promise of involvement, no compromise of my independence. The calls stopped for a moment, replaced by texts outlining deadlines and expectations. Each ping tested my resolve, each message a temptation to return to the familiar patterns I had spent decades escaping. But the clarity I had gained over the past weeks, through evidence reflection and the first taste of independence, anchored me firmly. I closed the motel door behind me, leaving the phone untouched on the nightstand. I would act on my terms, not theirs. The next chapter would bring the confrontation, where evidence and resolve would define the outcome, and their attempts to control me would finally meet a steadfast boundary. The following morning, I gathered my printed evidence and sat at my laptop, ready to confront what had been denied for so long. Diane's posts, the copied lesson plans, the emails, the drafts, all meticulously organized and time-stamped, lay before me. I composed a professional statement outlining the intellectual property I had created, attaching screenshots, dates, and excerpts from my grandmother's will, confirming my ownership. I sent the statement to the relevant platforms and posted it online, ensuring clarity and accuracy. There was no drama in my words, no accusation beyond what the evidence proved. I simply presented the truth, letting the documents speak louder than anger or frustration ever could. Within hours, the response was immediate: supportive emails, inquiries, and acknowledgement from educators who had relied on my materials. Then came the backlash. Diane's legal threats appeared in my inbox, paired with attempts to flag my content on social media. She claimed copyright infringement, asserting that the work was now hers. I reviewed her notices, calmly comparing every point with the timestamps and legal documentation I had prepared. Her attempts to silence me only highlighted the authority of my position. Caleb called once, nervously trying to mediate, but I let the voicemail ring. This was no longer about family approval or reconciliation. It was about defending what was indisputably mine. Every message, every threat was countered with evidence, and I watched as the narrative shifted, as those who had dismissed me for years could no longer ignore the truth. I closed my laptop, feeling a steady weight of satisfaction. For the first time in decades, the silence that had surrounded my work and my voice was broken, replaced with acknowledgement and accountability. The next chapter would be about taking full control of my life, building independence, and finding fulfillment beyond the reach of those who had tried to erase me. I moved into a small apartment a few miles from the motel, a place with a door that locked securely and a window overlooking the quiet street below. It wasn't luxurious, but it was entirely mine, a space where I could organize my work, my schedule, and my thoughts without interruption or judgment. The first morning, I set up my tutoring materials and reviewed the responses to my professional statement. Parents, students, and former colleagues had reached out offering opportunities and words of encouragement. Each session I conducted reinforced the reality I had been building. I was seen respected and valued for my skills. Unlike the constant dismissal at home here, my guidance was recognized and appreciated. The simple satisfaction of helping a struggling student grasp a difficult concept, of seeing their confidence grow under my mentorship, reminded me that my worth had never depended on my family's approval. I began documenting my work carefully, establishing small programs and scholarships to support learners who lacked resources, much as I had during my years of tutoring. The act of giving back quietly without fanfare became a cornerstone of my new life. These initiatives were not about recognition. They were about creating something lasting, a way to ensure my efforts had impact beyond the constraints of my past. In this independence, I discovered a sense of freedom I had never known. The weight of approval, the burden of past betrayals, the constant negotiation of expectations, they all fell away, replaced with clarity and purpose. My daily routines, my interactions with students, and the small victories I accumulated built a life defined entirely by my choices and values. Tomorrow, I would reflect further on the journey that had brought me here and consider the lessons that betrayal, silence, and persistence had taught me about resilience and self-worth. Sitting at my desk in the apartment I now called my own, I reviewed the months behind me. Each step, from leaving the house to reclaiming my work, establishing my tutoring practice, and creating small programs to help others, had been deliberate. The years of silence, of invisibility, of overlooked contributions had not vanished, but they no longer held power over me. I recognized the resilience I had cultivated through every dismissal, every erased effort, every moment I had been forced to assert myself quietly. The boundaries I had set with Diane and Caleb remained firm. They reached out occasionally through messages or tentative calls, but I did not answer unless it was necessary. My autonomy had been hard-won, and I understood that preserving it required vigilance as much as courage. I had built a life defined by my choices, by the skills and knowledge that were inherently mine, and by the satisfaction of contributing meaningfully to others' growth. In the quiet moments between sessions and planning, I considered what it meant to truly measure self-worth. It was not in their approval, nor in fleeting moments of acknowledgement from those who once dismissed me. It was in the deliberate actions, the consistency, and the quiet victories that compounded over time. The scholarship programs, the tutoring successes, and the steady growth of my business became symbols of a life reclaimed. I allowed myself a long, steady breath, feeling the weight of past burdens lift slightly with every reflection. The estrangement of family was no longer a wound, but a reality I could navigate with clarity. I had discovered that independence once feared could be more fulfilling than the validation I had long sought. If freedom comes at the cost of family approval, would you still choose it? Can a life rebuilt quietly be more powerful than one defined by others? These were questions I carried with me, and the answers would continue to shape the life I had fought to reclaim.